I ask you then, do you think it was Boris Johnson who made that decision to purge his party of you guys, who he himself voted against, for instance, Theresa May's deal twice out of 3 times. He went with her once at the end, but he didn't lose the whip. Theresa May didn't do that to people, that cabinet that you sat in and on with Boris Johnson for some time. Or do you think it's the work of an even more unelected official, Dominic Cummings, the mastermind of the Leave EU campaign, the official campaign? Who is it? Is it Boris Johnson that's the puppet master, or is it Dominic doing this?
So I think it's very important to understand that in the end, the buck stops with the person in charge. Now, it may be the case that this is a strategy driven by Dominic, but the Prime Minister appointed Dominic, the Prime Minister supports Dominic, and the Prime Minister signed off on the strategy. And this is something that often happens in regimes. And actually, it used to happen traditionally with medieval English kings. The story was always, that the person at the top is fine, it's their advisors that's the problem. If only the king knew the terrible things that their favourites and advisors were doing. And people actually did this over with Nixon and Watergate. There was an enormous focus on their chiefs of staff and the people under them. And I think the sort of simple view, which is that you need to pin responsibility on the elected person at the top, is the correct view. And that although it's tempting to imagine there's some sort of secret Svengali who does the whole thing, you have to acknowledge that the person at the top has empowered that person, given that person the power, and must bear moral responsibility for what that person does.
If the courts find Boris Johnson guilty, essentially, of misleading Her Majesty over the prorogation of Parliament next week, is Boris Johnson's position as Prime Minister of this country untenable?
I don't think his position is untenable. I think the risk, though, is that we get into a form of Trumpian politics. In other words, almost certainly were the courts to find against the Prime Minister, he would, like Donald Trump, just try to shrug it off and say, I don't care about the courts, I've got the people on my side. And we're getting a sense of that already with his approach to prorogation, his approach to purging people, his statements about the fact that despite the fact that Parliament has voted for an extension, he's not going to go to Brussels and request that extension. So what will happen is not that his position becomes untenable, but that British politics will become increasingly divisive and polarized, because he will have doubled down on a tradition which I am also responsible for. So understand this cuts both ways. That I'm obviously criticizing Boris for being unconstitutional, but remember, I also participated in a vote. I voted against No Deal Brexit, and that vote was made possible by the Speaker breaking Constitutional Convention by allowing us to introduce a positive motion on a particular type of special order of the House. So there is a bigger problem happening in British politics, which is when it suits us, far too many of us are trying to break the rules to suit our own position. Let me be provocative to a crowd that is overwhelmingly a Remain crowd. How
do you know that? Do they smell a certain way?
Well, or? Please put up your hand if you voted Remain.
It was a good guess.
Okay, so
it's always good to check. A lot of presumption in politics isn't always good.
Absolutely. We have to have some intuitions as politicians, or we can't really operate at all. But if you look at people's attitude towards the second referendum, you can feel the same thing, which is that for many of us, we are beginning to get into a mindset that the end justifies the means, that we are becoming increasingly determined to ignore process and outcomes we don't like in order to get to what we think is right. And so I think if we're going to challenge what Boris is doing, which is what I want to do, we also have to be quite disciplined with ourselves, and people like me need to be more careful about how I approach the constitution and process, as well as attacking him on the other direction.
I think that's a very interesting point to make, but I particularly asked that question about Boris Johnson's position becoming untenable, not just because it came up on social media, that was one of the questions that came in, but also because people like Sir Ming Campbell, former leader of the Lib Dems, a former Scottish QC, has actually said he has to resign next week because you can't lie to the Queen about your real reasons for suspending Parliament, not least when your Defence Secretary has been overheard saying at an event, well, the real reason we did it was because we need some space and a lack of scrutiny on Brexit. I'm badly paraphrasing Ben Wallace. But that is out there in the public domain, if nothing else. So I just wanted to understand, why do you think somebody like that, who no longer really does have skin in the political game, would say that? And he wasn't saying it in a mischievous way, he was saying it in a very serious way.
So I think, Emma, that in the past, prime ministers almost certainly would have resigned. So, but we're getting into this is why I'm drawing the analogy with Trump.
Yes.
I mean, if you were the editor of the New York Times, you would have felt for the last 2.5 years you had produced a story every week that would inevitably lead to the resignation of the president, and doesn't. So Ming is correct. I think in the past, many of these things would lead to resignation. But I also think that my reading of the strategy that Boris is pursuing is such that he's very, very unlikely to respond to a court case by resigning, because he probably feels that a chunk of the country, I don't know how much chunk of the country, but a chunk of the country will support him, because a chunk of the country will feel, here is this out of touch group of people sitting on the top of a pyramid. I don't know who they are. They're politicians, they're journalists, they're judges, and they're trying to undermine the will of the people. And if he aligns himself with people against them and portrays the judges as being part of this out of touch conspiracy, he can ride it through.
That's sort of Parliament versus the people, establishment versus the people strategy.
And he is a sort of, I think for many of his voters, he's a sort of hand grenade which is being thrown at that group.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.